Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Let me just ask you a question. If somebody tells your country, you know what, you can just pound sand, probably not going to be real fond of that, especially if it's coming from an ally. But that's exactly what happened just hours ago. And it's coming out of the Middle East with Bibi Netanyahu. And here to try to break some of that down, we had David Sachs coming to us from the West Coast, coming to us live on there. He's an entrepreneur and a software investor, co-host of the All In podcast, and just all around connected guy. It has some great ideas, and we're grateful to have you back on the show, David.
Good to be back.
Well, this is a very interesting topic we have here. So obviously, all this issue with Israel has just been, eating up all the oxygen in the Western press since October 7th, and for understandable reasons. And all kinds of horrific scenes have been coming out from really both sides of the line, at least when it started back in October, and then it continues to on the Palestinian side of that fence. Things are getting a lot more dicey and a lot more difficult. The region itself, the risk of war escalating beyond the borders of the Gaza Strip continued to rise. And that should get, number one, by itself, get a lot of interest to American audiences here. But the issue has always been, of course, we're support our ally Israel and their prime minister, because they had this horrible terrorist attack on October the 7th, and naturally they have every right to go after those who did that to them. But as we talked about a lot, it also matters how you go after and how you try to bring people to justice. And when it comes to the United States providing support and help to Israel, it also matters how they do it, because our name is going to get attached to a lot of that, and that's going to affect our ability to influence those around us, and also people, even our own values and the morals that we try to hold others to. Now, that's been kind of a shady issue here, David, but something happened today, just hours ago, that makes this a lot more complicated, in my view. Now, to get into that, I want to kind of get a running start here, and then get your view on where you think this is going here. But President Biden has been saying really from the beginning that he's looking for a two-state solution. Yes, what Hamas did is reprehensible and needs to be dealt with, but the larger issue, there needs to be a two-state solution. Here's what he said.
I made it clear to the Israelis that to Bibi and to his war cabinet that I think the only ultimate answer here is a two-state solution that's real.
Okay, so he's made it clear to Bibi Netanyahu that the only solution is the two-state solution. And as I understand, I actually watched an earlier podcast of yours in where that was kind of your view too, that the only good solution is a two-state solution.
Yeah, I mean, every American president has supported a two-state solution. I think every international observer has supported a two-state solution. If you go back to the UN partition plan in 1947, that was effectively a two-state solution. And if you go back to the British Peel Commission, which I think was in the 1930s, that was effectively called for a two-state solution. I mean, every outside observer of this conflict recognizes that the only way to achieve peace is for each of these two peoples to have their own space, to have their own country. And the conflict will continue until you resolve that. So yeah, I think what Biden is saying here is not different than what pretty much every American president has said since this conflict started.
And I think for a good reason, because it just can't work if you have one entire people's, especially when you're talking about like 5 million Palestinians, including the West Bank. You just can't have a situation where they have no self-governance ability and certainly no freedom, as is in the case with Gaza Strip. So that's reasonable and it's rational that would be an American policy. Now, it starts to get a little bit dicier the further we got into this. And John Kirby went on, I believe it was a couple of months ago, and said that there are some additional issues that affect Americans.
We are going to continue to support Israel. We're going to continue to make sure they get the security assistance that they need, the ability to go after Hamas, which is still a legitimate target set for them and still poses a genocidal threat to the Israeli people at the same time. And we've been saying this since the early hours of the conflict. At the same time, we want to make sure that our Israeli counterparts do so in accordance with the law of war, and that they do everything they can to minimize civilian casualties, as well as minimizing damage to civilian infrastructure like hospitals. And in the conversations, again, I don't want to get into the diplomacy too much, but in the conversations that we've been having with them, including at the secretary's level, they have acknowledged that they agree with that approach.
Okay, so the president said it's an American policy that's a two-state solution. Kirby added that you have to follow the laws of war and you have to minimize civilian casualties, and critically, you have to minimize the attacks on the civilian infrastructure, both things that we try to hold Russia to, for example. And so we have to be consistent with how we do that. But things started to fray a little bit here recently, and 5 days ago, Netanyahu sent a pretty barely concealed message to fire across the bow of the Americans.
אנחנו מציינים היום 100 ימים למלחמה, 100 ימים ליום הנורא שבו נטבחו ונחטפו אזרחינו. אנחנו ממשיכים במלחמה עד הסוף, עד לניצחון המוחלט, עד שנשיג את כל יעדינו, חיסול החמאס, השבת כל חטופינו, והבטחה שעזה לעולם לא תהווה עוד איום על ישראל. אף אחד לא יעצור אותנו. לא האג, לא ציר הרשע, ולא אף אחד אחר.
Now, if anyone wasn't clear who nor anyone else meant, he removed all doubt this afternoon.
For 30 years, I am very consistent, and I'm saying something very simple. This conflict is not on the lack of a state of Palestinian, but the existence of a state, the Jewish state. Every area that we evacuate, we receive terrible terror against that. It happened in South Lebanon, in Gaza, and also Judea and Samaria, which we did it. And therefore, I clarify that in any other arrangement, in the future, the state of Israel have to control on the entire area from the river to the sea. This is what happens when you have sovereignty. This truth I say to our American friends. And I also stopped the attempt to impose us a reality that will jeopardize us. A prime minister in Israel has to be able to say no, even to the best of friends. To say no when you need to and to say yes when you can.
Yeah, here's what I'm hearing about that, David. I'm hearing, look, pound sand, America. I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't want to hear any more of your opinions. I want your dollars, and I want your bullets, and I want your missiles, and then I want you to stay to the side while I do what I want to do. Is that in America's national interest?
Well, this is the second statement that Netanyahu's made in recent weeks that I think's been fairly damaging to Israel's cause in the United States. A few weeks ago, he said words to the effect that he was proud that he had sabotaged a two-state solution. Now here he's saying effectively that there can only be one state from the river to the sea, which is Israel. And I've always supported that over the past 30 years. That's basically what he's saying. So he's confirming that he has always rejected a two-state solution. And the reason why I think this is damaging is because the debate, at least in the US, I think for a long time, has been around who is principally responsible for the failure of the two-state process, who is principally responsible for the failure to achieve some sort of peace deal. And supporters of Israel, of which I would consider myself one, have always maintained that Israel is not the party that's responsible for the failure. It's the Palestinians. It's Arab rejectionism, which has prevented there from being a deal. But what Netanyahu has said now and again in a previous statement is that he's proud that he sabotaged the two-state solution. He's basically admitted that he had no interest in it. And he's been the dominant politician in Israeli politics for, 25 years. He first was elected prime minister in 1996. So, I think this is, again, damaging because it's sort of pulling the mask off this idea that it is only Palestinian rejectionism that has caused the two-state solution to fail. Bibi's saying that, look, I've never supported it. I'm not going to support it. And I don't really care who supports it, including the United States.
So here's the question, David. Where do we go now? Because Bibi has now publicly called us out at the highest levels. I mean, even as a nation, I'm going to tell America no, but he still wants all of our support. What do we do? Do you think if there's any chance that President Biden is going to say, Oh, okay. Well, if that's your point, then how about we just take some of that money back? How about we put some big strings, maybe even ropes on some of this, that it's going to have to go this way or we're not going to give any more? Do you see any prospect for that?
Uh, Probably not, although I do think that over time there could be more calls for that in the United States. This isn't the first time that Netanyahu has said things to this effect. If you go back to the Obama administration, which was the last time there was a serious effort made to achieve a two-state solution, this was when John Kerry, I think, was Secretary of State, and
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton also tried. In any event, under Obama, there was a serious attempt to try and make a two-state deal. And there was a lot of reporting on that Netanyahu wouldn't go for it and basically sabotaged it. And Netanyahu's position, there's again quite a bit of covering, sort of inside reporting on meetings that he had with John Kerry, where he basically said to Kerry, listen, you don't live here, you don't know, you don't understand the security situation, and it is just militarily unacceptable to us that we could have a militarized Palestinian state on our West Bank, and we're just never going to go for that. And that was basically what he said. So, he's made this position, I'd say, not as clear as he's making it now in recent weeks, but he said this in the past. It's just that it was never really fully reported, and so I don't think that the American people have ever had to come to grips with this idea that the current Israeli leadership is not really interested in a two-state solution, and that rejectionism might not just be on the Arab side. There's a school within Israeli politics that's rejectionist as well. So the question is, what do we do in the face of that?
Right, and that is a big question. And in fact, on the sidelines of Davos, Secretary Blinken, actually before this statement was made, was saying, "Hey, look, Israel's neighbors, they want peace. They want to bring this together, and they're cool with providing security guarantees for Israel." A little curious here, but let's let him talk for himself.
Unlike any time in the past, virtually all of its neighbors, its Arab neighbors, its Muslim neighbors, are prepared, indeed want to integrate Israel into the region. And they're prepared to give it the kind of security assurances and commitments and guarantees that they never would have given in the past. But they're equally committed to a pathway to a Palestinian state because they believe strongly, and we believe as well, that until that question is resolved, you're never really going to have peace and stability.
Okay, so now again here, that was right before Netanyahu made this statement here. So the question is going to be, what is the American position going to be? Because I think they're absolutely right that Arabs, they want some peace, and a lot of them don't like the Hamas at all for reasons I think we've talked about before, but they do want peace. But for their own people, especially the Arabs, they've got to have a two-state solution. Now, if Netanyahu's taken that off the table, where do we go? What is the Secretary of State going to say now?
I don't think there is a good place to go. If America is willing to use coercion and basically say to Israel, we're only going to support you if you support a two-state solution, then that would be one policy approach. But we have not really done that. I guess the last time any American president really tried to change the Israeli government's behavior was George H.W. Bush. This is in the early 90s with when James Baker was Secretary of State. They tried to condition loan guarantees on Israel's acceptance of a two-state solution. And but that was the last time I can think of. Before Bush Sr., Reagan also applied pressure to the Israeli government during the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, where Reagan called up Menachem Begin and basically said, you got to stop this. This bombing of Lebanon is a Holocaust. He actually used that word. And Begin didn't like hearing that, but he called back Reagan 20 minutes, said, okay, we'll stop. And the bombing stopped. But really, you have to go all the way back to Reagan and Bush Sr. to find a president who is willing to stand up to the Israelis and just tell them they got to do something they don't want to do. Obama tried for a two-state solution, but wasn't really willing to basically apply pressure in any way. And since then, no American government's really been willing to apply pressure to Israel in that way.
Yeah, and
yeah, sorry, just to
Sure.
just to add something, I think the thing that Bush Sr. was concerned about was the building of settlements as well. And they wanted to condition loan guarantees to settlements being stopped. Or actually, this may have happened under Obama as well. And Obama just got totally rolled over that. So it's this, the American government, because it sees Israel as a friend and an ally, doesn't want to apply that sort of coercive pressure to the Israeli government. But you can see now that we have a leader of Israel who is expressly saying that he has no interest in a two-state solution, which is not, where American policy is, that we really now have, I think, a difficult choice.
Yeah, and I think that the situation is now significantly compounded, worse than even back in the Reagan Bush days or anything like that, because of the risk of this war expanding. And in fact, it's already started to expand beyond. So not only do we have all the issues going on in the Red Sea, and now with direct attacks on Houthis vowing to retaliate against American interest in the region, you still have the continuing situation going on with the U.S. troops in Iraq and in Syria. That's spreading here. Now then we're seeing a more bold Iran, because I think that there's the way that they're starting to see that the lot of the world is starting to detach a little from the U.S. And I think this whole issue with the IJC court from the South Africa trying to bring a genocidal charge, and how we're one of the now fewer people that are against that, when a lot more people are starting to be for it. And I think that Iran is going, number one, okay, we're not so alone anymore, and you don't have so many friends. And so they're starting to take a little bit more risk with some of their actions here, like with the assassination into Iraq, into Pakistan. And of course, we keep striking into Baghdad against Iraqi people. Israel is striking Iranian people in Syria and elsewhere. And everybody's always vowing revenge, and things are getting, at risk of spreading in. And now then we have also, just a couple of days ago, we have one of the senior Israeli generals that makes it pretty clear they're thinking of launching an additional war.
רוצים להגיע בלבנון למטרה מאוד ברורה. זה להחזיר את התושבים לצפון, כל היישובים בצפון. אנחנו מבינים שהדבר הזה חייב לעבור דרך שינוי מאוד משמעותי. אני לא יודע מתי המלחמה בצפון. אני יודע להגיד לכם שהסבירות לזה שהיא קורית בחודשים הקרובים, וכשנצטרך אנחנו נלך קדימה בכל הכוח.
So there has been many people talking in Israel for quite a while now that they don't want to just take care of the issue with Hamas. They want to get rid of all of this stuff, and after they finish Hamas, they want to turn up there anyway. So now then the risk is going further. And as we've seen from from Iran, not just in the things that I just mentioned, but their foreign minister made some pretty bold and pretty confident attacks, verbal attacks against the United States, and making it sound like that, they're ready to throw some weight around here. The risk of wars escalating and that could potentially draw us in is getting higher and higher. So I don't think that we can afford to just let Israel do whatever it wants, because that could draw us into a war.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think a wider regional war that America gets drawn into is in America's interest. I have seen reporting that the Biden administration has told the Netanyahu government in no uncertain terms that they do not want to see this war expand into Lebanon, into a war with Hezbollah. The problem is that if that happens somehow, is the U.S. really going to leave Israel to its own devices? I mean, if Israel really gets in a war for its survival, is the United States going to stay out of it and potentially let Israel get destroyed? I don't think so. So,
yeah, but I think we should, though, because Israel can handle Hezbollah if it goes there. Now, if it gets into a bigger one, that's a separate issue, though. I would argue that Israel we given them all these billions of dollars every year so that they have a military that's strong enough to do it. So I would hope that we wouldn't, certainly just like an Article 5 kind of deal, automatically go in with them. But I know there's a lot of people in the U.S. that want exactly that.
Yeah, and I think that the Biden administration is smart to convey to the Israelis that they do not want to see a war break out in the north with Hezbollah. But just because the Biden administration wants that doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Right.
And then we'll be put to the test in terms of what we're willing to do. So yeah, I could see us getting drawn in despite our desire not to be.
Right, and that's one of my biggest concerns, and I think that. And obviously, we're going to wait and see how the administration responds to this. But Netanyahu's been very clear to lay out his markers of what's important to him and where he's willing to go and where he's willing to say stop. And I think that it's really time that the American president be equally candid and say, "I got it. You're our friend and our ally, have been for many years. and here's my limits, and here's where I'm not willing to go, and put it on the table and be willing to do something. Because I'm afraid, David, if he doesn't, Netanyahu's going to continue to call the shots, and we may end up in a war that gets our American troops killed. God only knows what could happen in the region. Nobody knows the economic potential impacts better than you do if something breaks out like that. And I think we got to do something. We can't just let events take control of us.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the situation could easily spiral out of control. Biden, however, has always been reluctant to criticize Israel publicly. And there was a very interesting article in Mother Jones recently about this, talking about how Biden was perhaps the single most hawkish politician in America on Israel. And during the Obama administration, during that peace process that I mentioned, where John Kerry was kind of our emissary to the Middle East, trying to put this together, there was a lot of reporting in that article on how Biden basically sabotaged that two-state process. He was kind of very aligned with Netanyahu on that. And one of the things it said is that in Biden's worldview, that any disagreements between the U.S. and Israel should be handled behind closed doors. He doesn't like the idea of publicly criticizing Israel, that there should be no daylight publicly between the two countries. So this is why you're seeing a reluctance to sort of criticize Israel or rein them in any way. We don't know exactly what's happening behind closed doors, but I guess the point is that Biden's efforts to rein in the Netanyahu government just with exhortations that happen privately may not be good enough. And he may need to state some red lines in terms of what the U.S. is willing to do or not. I mean, maybe those are being made privately, but
yeah, and I think that's actually a wise course of action. I think that's what we should be doing. A lot of this stuff to be privately, but now, in my view, Netanyahu has changed the dynamics, because he now went public in directly calling out the United States and saying that he'll tell us no. And so right now, we haven't told Israel no on anything, at least not that we're aware of. And it remains to be seen whether Biden is going to do that or whether he's going to keep talking behind the scenes. But nothing seems to change on the front side, because, look, the whole reason why this South African thing has any traction at all is because, look, we got a clip here we can show of some of the recent destruction and damage, both of a university in Palestine and of a media person, independent media guys walking around and showing, look, they're just completely destroying stuff. And so it gives evidence that some of this stuff has some merit. And this is stuff that's the University of Palestine right there. And look, this is stuff that is affecting our credibility and our standing in the world as well. When stuff like this just gets out, I mean, the building was already a shell, and they completely destroyed it. Obviously, that was not an accident. That was something they planned to do. And Gary, can you roll that shot from, I believe it was yesterday, from that Palestinian, not Palestinian, but that independent media guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's...
Israel killed the drone guy, the drone friend, so there will not be any drone shots to show the massive destruction of the main way. They killed all the journalists that have drones, lost my drones, they hacked it, as you saw before. So I'm trying to show it with my phone, with my camera. So as you can see behind the guy who's filming me with the phone now, it's all about destruction. We lost a lot. We lost our homes, our friends, our families, our life, our work, our future, even the past. Our past, we lost the people we lived with. So as you can see there, different camera here. It's all about destruction.
This is what a lot of the people around the world are seeing, and they're not viewing it through the same lens that people in the United States do. Is I think you're aware. I think if you've been talking about some of this stuff, and it's definitely the Houthis. This whole issue in the Red Sea, none of this started until about a week or so after Israel started its ground invasion into the Gaza Strip. And so now then that's escalated, and they show no signs of backing down from that again. And that's just putting us in a very, very tough situation. Do we escalate that, or do we be seen as backing down? And there's just no easy answers, and there's no obvious right answers, but it's a mess. And I just don't think that the U.S. can afford to continue to be passive and let Israel go and do whatever it wants, because we're being painted by that, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I understand how Biden feels to some degree, because, you know, as a supporter of Israel, you don't like to criticize them when they're in the middle of a war. But on the other hand, when you see video like that where they're destroying a university in Gaza that doesn't appear to have any military purpose, it's getting harder and harder to defend their actions. You combine that with the fact that huge number of civilians have been killed in Gaza, that they seem to be making the place uninhabitable, that whether you want to call it genocide or not, it's clearly a humanitarian crisis. Some over 20,000 Palestinians have been killed, over 50,000 wounded, something like 1.8 million have had to flee their homes. Maybe their homes have been destroyed already. So it's just getting harder and harder for even supporters of Israel to defend their actions. And, you know, again, I don't like criticizing them when they're in a war, but I just don't see the justification for all of these actions. You then combine it with the fact that Netanyahu is explicitly rejecting a two-state solution, not just now, but basically forever, and basically saying that he's always rejected it. And I just don't see the future for Israel that he's creating. I don't understand where he's leading them to. It's a future of perpetual conflict and war with the Arab world. I mean, not just the Palestinians, but the entire Arab world. And so I just don't get it. I mean, as you know, look, I don't live there. I don't have skin in the game the way they do. And I'm sure what Netanyahu would say is, you know, we actually live here. We understand the situation. You don't. We know what we're dealing with. You're just basically a bunch of mushy-headed American liberals. Fair enough, but nonetheless, I'm just not seeing where he's leading them. It just feels like he's leading them into a cul-de-sac.
And I'll tell you, from looking at it through a military set of eyes who has fought in situations very similar to this in some regards, I can tell you that he is leading them to a no-win situation, because he wants to say, we're going to go in tough, we're going to destroy Hamas, and then we're going to bring peace to Israel. That's what he's overtly stating. The only way that happens is if they somehow succeed in literally emptying the Gaza Strip and probably the West Bank of all Palestinians. And I see no possibility that the world will sit by and let that happen. I think even the Americans who are supportive can't go that far. If you don't, then all of these things you're doing with the scenes that you're seeing right there, with all of these thousands of people that are getting killed, you are creating so much more animosity against Israel than ever existed prior to the 7th of October. So there's just no way that what he's doing here is going to bring peace to Israel. It's just bringing infinitely more problems that's going to have to be solved. And it doesn't matter how much force you use, you can't kill your way to peace.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, this debate about what to do with the Palestinians, and specifically whether Israel would basically try to go for either a greater Israel or be a more limited Jewish state. This debate's been around since the beginning of Israel. If I could, I just want to read you this quote from David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister, sort of the founding father of Israel. He was speaking to the Knesset in 1949, in the wake, April of 1949, in the wake of the War of Independence, where, you know, Israel basically was established as a state. And he was being asked why the IDF was not going into the West Bank. And what he said is, the IDF can capture the entire territory between the river and the sea. But what sort of country would that give us? We would have a Knesset with an Arab majority. Faced with either a greater Israel or a Jewish Israel, we choose a Jewish Israel. And so he understood that if you take possession of this greater Israel, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, you're now going to have over 5 million Palestinians, you know, under your control. Now, he just assumed that the country would be democratic and they would have a vote, and therefore they would vote for it not to be a Jewish Israel. But he understood there was a tension there between greater Israel and Jewish Israel. And what Netanyahu seems to be saying here is there is only going to be one state from the river to the sea. So he's directly contradicting the point that Ben-Gurion was making, but somehow this is going to be a Jewish state. Well, how? You know,
right.
What are you going to do with those? You know, now you have 2 million Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of Israel, within Green Line Israel. But you got close to what, 5.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. If you have one state from the river to the sea, what do you do with all those people? Are you going to have them live permanently under occupation without any political rights? I mean, this would make true the accusation of Israel being an apartheid state, if it is not already true. This would guarantee that Israel would become an apartheid state. So again, I just don't understand the future that Netanyahu is providing for Israel if he's ruling out the possibility of some sort of Palestinian state. You know, what sort of future is he giving them? So I just don't understand the math on this. I feel like there's a math equation here.
Yeah.
And now, like you said, I mean, maybe there's a solution where they expel all of these Palestinian Arabs from the West Bank and Gaza Strip. But like you said, hard to see that happening, hard to see the world allowing that. I mean, we call that ethnic cleansing now. So, so I just don't understand what the game plan here is.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of Israelis who've made this point. I was listening to a really interesting one. His name is Ami Ayalon. I don't know if if you're familiar with him, but he was he's a former chief of Shin Bet, which is the Israeli security service. And he basically made the point that, look, the Palestinian, our misconception is, in Israeli politics, is thinking somehow that the Palestinians aren't a people. He said they are a people. They're willing to kill and be killed for their independence. So you have to work out a deal with them at some point, unless you want to make us a permanent occupier of these, 5 million plus people. And he thought it was a big mistake that Israel. I mean, obviously, he thinks that Israel's on the wrong path right now, but he goes back to 2002 when the Arab League floated a peace plan where all 22 nations in the Arab League would have signed a peace deal with Israel, given them full diplomatic recognition. They basically would have recognized their right to exist and considered the matter of the Arab-Israeli conflict completely over and settled if Israel would agree to go back to the 1967 lines. That was basically the deal that was on the table from the Arab League in 2002. And, Ariel Sharon was prime minister then and never engaged with it. And you look back and I think that was just a huge mistake.
Imagine if they had put that, and let's say it took a decade to unwind. Today, there would be peace in Israel and everybody would have at least a chance, at least compared to what it has been. But it wasn't even tried.
Yeah, well, I mean, and this isn't my point. This is Ami Ayalon's point that we should have gone for the 2002 deal, and it wasn't perfect. I mean, did it create security risks for Israel? Absolutely. I mean, I think there are legitimate reasons why Netanyahu is concerned about security. I mean, if you just look at a topographical map of Israel, you'll see that the West Bank is the high ground, and it can, if they ever decide to rain down rockets and missiles from that high ground onto the coastal plain where Tel Aviv is, which is the most densely part of Israel, that's a very dangerous security situation. So I can see why the Israelis would have been concerned. I can see why a security hardliner like Netanyahu was concerned about it. But I think that all things considered, the point that Ayalon's making that seems logical to me is that this was the best chance. I mean, it wasn't a perfect deal, but it was the best deal they could get. And now they've just seemed like they're kind of rejecting any deal and not thinking any deal is possible. So I just don't see where this goes from here.
Yeah, and we're going to certainly find out. And I think everybody's going to be watching to see what comes out of the White House in the next day or two, just to see where we're going to go with that. But David, in the last few minutes that we have here, I want to touch on a different subject that I know is kind of something important to you because you've tweeted about it a lot, and that's Gonzalo Lira and the issue with an American citizen that was imprisoned in Ukraine. It said a lot of incendiary stuff that the Ukraine government didn't like, that he was imprisoned and then he was let out on parole, I think, or on bail, then said some more things and was put back in there, and nothing happened, even though he was apparently very worried about his safety, was worried about what was going to happen to him, was appealing to the U.S. to help him out. And it's like we went and turned a blind eye, and then he actually did die in prison. And look, the people can, and I've seen a lot of people have they didn't like, even a lot of Americans didn't like some of the stuff he said, but I think, as you're pointing out, that's not really the issue about what he said or whether you agreed with him or not, but the fact that he was an American citizen that we basically left in a prison to die among our alleged ally in Ukraine. What can you tell us a little bit more about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, so Gonzalo Lira was, let's call it, an opinion journalist who lived in Ukraine. Apparently, he moved there in 2010. He married a Ukrainian woman. He has a couple of kids who live there. And I think, from what I understand, that's one of the reasons why he stayed in that country, is he wanted to stay with his kids. And then the war broke out, and he started posting videos on YouTube that were very critical of the Zelensky regime. He said things, though, that I thought were, I mean, I haven't watched all of it, but I've seen clips of it. And a lot of the points he's making, even though he might go further than what I would say, or he would make certain points that I wouldn't necessarily say because I'm not sure I've got the proof for it. Nonetheless, in the main, I thought the gist of what he was saying about the Zelensky regime, about how it was bankrolled by a Ukrainian oligarch named Igor Kolomoisky, who also was one of the founders of Burisma, who was also bankrolling Hunter Biden. You know, he's making points like this, making points about the involvement of Victoria Nuland and the neocons in that country since 2014. In the main, I thought the gist of what he was saying is consistent with the research that I've done. But he was saying these things that were highly critical and embarrassing to the Zelensky government. And eventually he was arrested for that. He was put under house arrest. And then he made a video saying, I want to leave the country. I'm going to go to the border. I'm going to try and leave. And if I'm captured doing this, I expect I'm probably going to die in a Ukrainian prison. And in his last video, he said that I've been trying to get the U.S. State Department to help me. They have not been helping me. And I'm calling on all of you who might be watching this video to try and put in a good word, to try and create some outcry so that the U.S. State Department does what it's supposed to do. When Americans are imprisoned in foreign countries for doing really nothing more than exercising their First Amendment constitutionally protected right to engage in free speech. And remember, all he did here was post YouTube videos. That's his opinions on an American platform. The State Department helps people like that. When Brittany Griner was basically arrested in Russia on a drug charge, the Biden administration moved heaven and earth to get her released. And, it appears that the State Department sat on its hands and did absolutely nothing. And sure enough, Gonzalo Lira died in a Ukrainian prison. I mean, all the Biden administration had to do was, make a phone call. I mean, they didn't have to make a phone call. I mean, all they have to do is send a text message. I mean, we're paying for the entire Zelensky regime. I mean, their salaries, their pensions, their weapons, the whole thing is funded by us. So, I don't believe that this was too hard a lift for our State Department. I think they simply didn't care about Gonzalo Lira because of the content of what he was saying. And as a result, Gonzalo Lira was imprisoned for basically thought crimes, for speech crimes in Ukraine, and he died in prison exactly as he predicted. And by the way, while this was going on, his father was appearing in independent media, appeared on Tucker Carlson, saying, my son is going to die in a Ukrainian prison unless the State Department gets him out. He is not in good health. We need to get him out right now. He also said that they're torturing him in there. They're abusing him, mistreating him. And so everybody was on notice that this was happening. And it's just remarkable to me that the Biden administration didn't lift a finger to help him. And I think it's part of a pattern that we see of the Biden administration of essentially weaponizing the justice system. I mean, American citizenship is supposed to be something that gives you rights and protections regardless of your political views. And, and even if you criticize the Biden government is still supposed to help you if you're an American citizen who finds yourself in that situation. And it's pretty clear that again, effectively, I think the Biden administration is weaponizing American citizenship. If they like what you're saying, they'll help you. If they don't like what you're saying, they'll pretend like you don't exist.
Well, and I think like that Ben Garrison comic that we put up there, that's the one right here. This does not make the Zelensky regime and Ukraine fit the mold that we keep talking about democracy, and they're on the front lines of democracy for all of Europe, et cetera. when, I mean, of course, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You also have the corruption. You've got the fact that they shut down political parties, newspapers that they didn't like, all these kinds of things, which we don't get a lot of talk about, but we just keep using this word democracy. And then now here, when we have a shot at doing something just for one of our own citizens, for God's sake, it's like we do nothing. Now, are you aware, was there any official statement from the State Department or the government at any point during all of these public requests to get him out?
Yes, they just pretended like he didn't exist. A reporter from Gray Zone asked one of our, at a press conference, asked one of the flacks from the Biden administration, "What about Gonzalo Lira?" And he's like, "Who? Yeah, I got to check on that. I don't know anything about it." They knew. I mean, Victoria Nuland knew who Gonzalo Lira was, as he himself said, but they saw him as a thorn in their side. I mean, they saw him as, as a critic, maybe a gadfly, maybe an annoyance, but somebody they didn't like because of what he was saying. And they just didn't lift a finger to help him, even though they were all put on notice by Gonzalo's father and Gonzalo's own videos saying, "This is happening to me. This is about to happen to me. Please save me." And we didn't do anything. And your point is right, that this is not really, if you look at the pattern of behavior in Ukraine, what's unusual here is not that Gonzalo was imprisoned for his opinions. It's that it's only that they would do this to an American citizen. I mean, Gonzalo must have thought that somehow he was protected by his American citizenship, because I think prior administrations would have done something about this. Yeah. But the Zelensky regime, like you said, they've banned opposition political parties. They've controlled the media. You have to basically get licensed to be a reporter in Ukraine. So they effectively control the media. They've cracked down on Russian Orthodox churches and priests and nuns and all that kind of stuff. And like you said, the corruption is out of control. Like Time Magazine reported, quoting one of their officials, people are stealing like there's no tomorrow. Yeah. So when you talk about this country being a democracy and we've got to save democracy, it's certainly not a democracy of the type that we recognize. It's a democracy, if you want to call it that, that believes in silencing its political opponents. It believes in canceling elections. Remember, Zelensky was supposed to have an election this year that he canceled. And it believes in basically arresting the political opposition. Arestovich, Arestovich just did an interview with Unheard.
I saw that.
Yeah, where Arestovich used to work for Zelensky, and now he's broken with him, and he's announced he's planning to run for president against Zelensky if and when elections are ever restored. And Freddie Sayers, who's the interview, noted at the beginning of the interview that Arestovich is currently in the U.S. because he fears getting arrested if he goes back to Ukraine. So, I mean, what sort of democracy is this when the political alternatives and the critics face imprisonment and potentially torture and death?
And don't you find it so ironic that while we talk about how it's, the Russians are this totalitarian, this hardliners and all this stuff, they're actually having their presidential election in March, I think it is, whereas the so-called Democratic side says, yeah, you just can't do it under war. That's their claim. Well, they are on the other side of the line. How is it that the democracy can't do a presidential election?
Yeah, I mean, everything they accuse of Putin is basically true of Zelensky. I mean, it's true Navalny is in a Russian prison, but Arestovich would be too if he was there.
I'm not defending Russia at all.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. It's just it's totally hypocritical. It's a double standard. Really, the only difference is that Putin is actually popular in Russia, whereas Zelensky is not popular in Ukraine. That's why Putin doesn't need to cancel the election, whereas Zelensky does. But yeah, it's totally hypocritical. There's not, but both of these states are corrupt, oligarchical, authoritarian regimes. I mean, they're not that different. And we've basically involved ourselves in this type of civil war that goes back a long way. And, and it's really none of our business, but the idea that we're preserving democracy is ludicrous. But the Biden administration makes the same claim when they, in all this lawfare against Trump. I mean, they're basically trying to put their main political opponent in jail too. So, there is a common denominator between the Biden administration and the Zelensky administration, is that they both believe that preserving democracy means that they can jail their political opponents. It's very hypocritical, obviously.
Yeah.
But I would say this is why I think the Gonzalo Lira story is so important. Is I think it's a character defining moment for both the Zelensky and Biden regimes. I mean, you really show the character of a regime by how they treat powerless political
Yes.
opponents. Gonzalo Lira wasn't a threat to anybody. They could have just expelled him from the country if they didn't
Yeah.
like him, what they were doing. Just kick him out.
Yeah, it could have been solved. Yeah, at much lower level. It's just so shameful and humiliating that we didn't do the absolute minimum and just get him out of the country. We just did nothing and just let him languish in jail. It's shameful. And
All we had to do was whisper the words, and they would have basically just release him, expel him. It would have been done the next day if Biden had cared.
Yes, it would have been. Well, unfortunately, this is not the end of that. All these stories here, they're going to continue on. We're going to continue to watch what happens here in the United States as well with our own presidential elections. But we are very grateful for your time today. Thank you for coming on, David. I know you're a very busy guy, and we're very grateful for you spending some time here with Daniel Davis Deep Dive.
Absolutely. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And we will see you on our next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive. As with all these other issues, we remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is, so that you can make sense of your world. Thanks. Like and subscribe and share with your friends. And we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.